Hi everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the rape of Nanking and also Japanese internment, both of which sort of take place in and around World War II. So questions to consider as we move through this video. First, what is the rape of Nanking? Secondly, why did the United States decide to intern Japanese nationals and Japanese Americans? And then finally, what is Korematsu versus the United States, and what did it decide? Here is a list of key terms you should keep an eye out for during the video. These are always going to be in blue, underlined, and bolded. So before we talk about the rape of Nanking, it's important for us to understand some of the relationship tensions between the Chinese and the Japanese before the outbreak of World War II. So geographically, China and Japan are only separated by sort of a small stretch of ocean. We sort of see here in the Sea of Japan. They're very, very close together. But these two countries sort of take on different, they sort of go on different paths as we move towards World War II. Japan moves towards modernization and industrialization, given Western influence and if we remember from our imperialism video, Japan is actually forced to modernize by the United States and other Western European countries. But China doesn't necessarily take that route. And thus, Japan sort of views China, who is not industrial, as sort of this antiquated civilization. In Japan, as they modernized, also sort of built up their military and would frequently invade China, sort of leading to the First and Second Sino-Japanese Wars. So there were a lot of tensions between these two countries. So the rape of Nanking is a mass murder and mass rape that's committed by Imperial Japanese troops against residents of Nanking, which at the time was the capital of China during the Second Sino-Japanese War. So the rape of Nanking really is a mass murder of the civilian population of Nanking. It occurred over a period of about 6 weeks, starting in 1937, the day that the Japanese captured Nanking in China, and the Japanese forces killed an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 Chinese, and most of them were civilians. According to records, around 20,000 women, including children and the elderly, were raped during the occupation. Women and children were often immediately killed after being raped, and usually using very explicit methods. So the rape of Nanking is this mass murder of civilians by the Japanese against the Chinese. And it's really difficult to know exactly how many people were killed during this event. Military records were kept secret, and after Japan surrenders in 1945, we actually see a lot of these records are destroyed. So no one really knows exactly how many individuals were killed during the rape of Nanking because the Japanese destroyed all of those records. But the sort of general consensus, it puts those numbers between 200,000 and 300,000. But this death toll has sort of been actively contested for many, many years, and we will sort of never know just how many civilians were killed at the hands of the Japanese. And what's important to note is that the Japanese had sort of removed themselves from the League of Nations following the invasion of Manchuria in 1931. But the League of Nations sort of sat back and did nothing to stop these atrocities. This group, again, is formed for collective peace and collective security in the world. And sort of when the Chinese needed that help, they did not get it. The League of Nations just sort of sat back and let this mass murder happen. And it did little to try and punish Japan for its actions. So the Japanese do join Adolf Hitler in World War II, and the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor is actually what gets the United States into World War II. So on December 7th, 1941, Japan sank or badly damaged all 8 battleships inside the Hawaiian naval base of Pearl Harbor. We see that 10 other ships are damaged, 188 planes are destroyed, and over 2,500 Americans are killed. So Pearl Harbor is an attack on American soil. It is what sort of pushes the United States 2 years after Hitler invades Poland to finally join World War II. And the Japanese believed that the attack on Pearl Harbor would sort of destroy the Pacific Fleet of the United States and sort of keep it from interfering in the Pacific. Now, the United States would end up fighting not only on the European front, but also the Pacific, in the Pacific as well. So although the United States' naval fleet sort of had a lot of damage as a result of Pearl Harbor, it doesn't actually keep the United States out of the Pacific. And so, again, the United States enters World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor, with President Roosevelt declaring December 7th would be, quote, a day that will live in infamy. This is sort of one of the major quotes President Roosevelt is sort of known for. But after December 7th, after this Japanese attack, this is what leads the United States to join the war. So after the United States enters the war, we start to see that there is a lot of animosity towards Japanese Americans and Japanese nationals who are living in the United States. And President Roosevelt authorizes Executive Order 9066, which authorizes the War Department, or as we know it, the Department of Defense. It allows the War Department to declare the West Coast, the entire West Coast, as a war theater, or an area where the military could sort of have jurisdiction. And Executive Order 9066 authorizes the relocation of Japanese Americans from the West Coast because they are seen as a threat to national security. Again, the reason the United States enters the war is because the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And so the Japanese Americans are sort of seen as having dual loyalty, and the United States government is concerned about spying and helping Japan over the United States. And so, even though the government considered relocation for Germans and Italians, sort of the other two groups of Americans who were who maybe had relationships with people living in countries that were actively fighting against the United States, the Japanese are the only ethnic group that are singled out and relocated. And so Executive Order 9066 authorizes the United States military to remove Japanese Americans and Japanese nationals from their homes to other places in the United States. And so Executive Order 9066 leads to Japanese internment. And we see that about 110,000 people of Japanese ancestry are forcibly interned in concentration camps. About a third of those are known as Asai, or foreign-born, and 2/3 are Nisei, or American-born. So Japanese internment did affect American citizens, and families are really only given about 48 hours to sell businesses, sell their possessions. They were not allowed to take much with them to these camps. And so they had 2 days to try and sell possessions, pack, and get ready to leave their homes. And never during this time were specific charges ever filed against these individuals who were interned. There were no charges of treason, no charges of helping a foreign power. There were no charges ever filed against the Japanese. So life in these camps was not at all good. These camps are located in desolate areas where conditions were harsh. They're sort of far away from any towns. They're very standalone sort of areas. And these camps are patrolled by armed guards. They're surrounded by barbed wire. A lot of the Japanese were told that this is for your own safety, and yet you can't help but wonder why armed guards and barbed wire are necessary for safety reasons. And each of these camps sort of functioned like its own town. There were schools, post office, there's farmland, and families were sort of housed in barracks and ate in communal eating areas. George Takei, who is sort of best known for his role on Star Trek, was actually forcibly interned in these camps when he was a child, and he sort of has the story of having to say the Pledge of Allegiance in one of these camps in school and sort of not sort of fully recognizing the irony of that situation. So there was resistance to Executive Order 9066 and Japanese internment, most notably in the form of the Supreme Court case Korematsu versus the United States. And we see a picture on this slide of Fred Korematsu, who is a Japanese American living in California who decided he was not going to leave his home. He was not going to relocate. He was going to stay. And he is arrested. He is convicted of violating the executive order. And the Supreme Court rules against Korematsu, saying that the evacuation order, that this forced relocation of Japanese nationals and Japanese Americans is valid and did not show racial prejudice, but rather responded to the imperative of keeping the U.S. secure from invasion. So the Supreme Court upheld an executive order that was only ever aimed at Japanese Americans and said that it was not racially prejudiced against Japanese Americans. And this precedent, or this sort of this decision, was actually never overturned until, ironically, during the travel ban case, Trump v. Hawaii, which was decided in 2018. That case, which upheld the travel ban, did strike down Korematsu as precedent. So Japanese internment is one of the biggest violations of civil liberties we've sort of ever seen in the United States. Once again, Japanese Americans were never charged with a crime. This internment was really all based on fear and racial prejudice. And monetarily, Japanese Americans lost about $105 million worth of farmland and roughly $500 million worth of income, not to mention sort of the untold amount of sort of personal savings, personal possessions that were lost due to this forced relocation, which again was racially motivated, and none of these individuals were ever charged with a crime. So key takeaways from this video. During the Second Sino-Japanese War, Imperial Japan committed mass murder and rape against the civilian population of Nanking, and there was no punishment for Japan from the international community. After the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which declared the West Coast a war theater and allowed the United States to intern 110,000 Japanese Americans and immigrants with really no basis. And then finally, Korematsu versus the United States upheld Japanese internment, saying the evacuation order was valid and did not show racial prejudice. And again, that precedent was not overturned until 2018 in the travel ban case, Trump v. Hawaii. Thanks for watching. I will see you all later.